As races around the country continue to heat up, for some, political divisions are becoming clearer. But as Americans, are we really that divided? You're listening to The Wrap from Central Florida Public Media. I'm Brendan Byrne. Politics has a way of sometimes dividing people. With just about a month left until ballots must be cast in the general election, for some, that division has become clearer. But others are leaning into the belief that, as Americans, we have more in common than not.
I'm conservative. I'm a Democrat, but I'm very conservative. Most of us are kind of somewhere in the middle and we have our differences.
We check back in with our panel of Central Florida voters about finding common ground during a divisive election season. That's ahead on The Wrap. But first, these headlines. A federal court has rejected a pro-abortion coalition's attempt to block the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration's commercials and websites targeting Amendment 4. Central Florida Public Media's health reporter Joe Mario Pedersen explains Amendment 4 is a ballot measure before voters that would grant abortion protections in the state constitution.
A Leon County judge rejected a request by the Floridians Protecting Freedom Coalition's request for an injunction. The coalition argued the agency was spreading misinformation about the amendment's ballot language. The judge said it was up to voters to decide on the facts of the campaign, not the court. Keisha Mulfer is a senior communications strategist with the American Civil Liberties Union, which is part of the Floridians Protecting Freedom. She says the state's argument of the ballot language being deceiving isn't factual.
And I think readers need to be reminded that it was the Florida Supreme Court who first of all, reviews citizen-led initiatives prior to its placement on a ballot and approved the language.
In a statement, the Florida Agency for Healthcare said it was pleased with the ruling and called the request a, quote, politically motivated attack. Joe Mario Pedersen, Central Florida Public Media.
Two new Florida laws that took effect this week could make things easier for people living with Alzheimer's disease in their interactions with law enforcement. Central Florida Public Media's Joe Burns has more.
Hundreds of thousands of Floridians have Alzheimer's disease, and most will wander off at some point. And when an officer encounters them, they can react with anxiety, fear, or hostility and become combative. They might not answer because they forgot their name or address. They forget social norms and sometimes make false claims of abuse. A new law creates optional training for police on recognizing someone with dementia, communicating with them using alternatives to physical restraints, and spotting abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Jennifer Braistad of the Alzheimer's Association says the law passed unanimously.
With HB 801 going into effect, law enforcement will actually be able to get continuing education now for this curriculum, which they have been asking for, and so now they'll actually be able to get credit for it.
A second law allows drivers to indicate a disability or disorder, like Alzheimer's, on their license. Joe Burns, Central Florida Public Media.
Port Canaveral kicked off its fiscal year with a record-setting $210 million operating budget. Port commissioners approved the figure in a 4-1 vote at a meeting last week. Projected operating revenue is expected to be heavily carried by cruise operations, with about $175 million of the $210 million in projected revenue will come from the cruise industry. The numbers build on yearly budget records that have grown since 2022. More than 7 million multi-day passengers came into the port through the end of August, which broke a record in passenger count. Port CEO Captain John Murray says the budget's approval comes before an expected boom in activity.
We're getting ready for the busiest season we've ever had in the port. So this is the calm before the storm.
The port expects at least 7 cruise ships will make their debut in the port in the next year, and it plans to add 27 workers next year to address the anticipated growth. These stories and more on our website. Visit cfpublic.org. Voter turnout in Central Florida amongst people ages 18 to 25 was lackluster in the August primary. In fact, Central Florida had 5 of the worst 10 counties across the state in voter turnout in that age group. So how are political campaigns and supervisors of elections working to bring younger voters to the poll? That story and more election coverage on our website. Visit cfpublic.org. We're less than 1 month away from the November elections. As races around the country continue to heat up, for some, political divisions are becoming clear. But as Americans, are we really that divided? A panel of local voters says no. We brought together a small but diverse group of Central Floridians to find out more about how people are feeling about this election. Doug Bowman is a 68-year-old registered Republican from East Orlando. Tiffany Jeffers is 42-year-old registered Democrat from Kissimmee. Tom Unrath is a 69-year-old Republican from Melbourne, and 64-year-old David Walker is an independent who lives just outside St. Cloud. They spoke with news director Latoya Dennis and Morning Edition host Talia Blake. Here's part of that conversation.
Many African Americans find themselves in the Democratic Party, capital D. But in reality, we are conservative, small c. In our behavior, in our mindset, family, we don't live lives out of control with no ethics. We want the best for our children and grandchildren. We want good education, good schools. We want to live in communities where home ownership and people take care of their property. That's conservative. The fundamental principle of conservative, and that's really the strength of the Republican Party, is those fundamental principles. And when you say that the party has left you, you couldn't have said it any better, because what they're showing today in many ways is not, the Republican Party of back in the day. And to be historically accurate, most Black people were Republicans first because of Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. I'll give you some great names. Jackie Robinson, Republican. Booker T. Washington, Republican. Because why? In the Republican Party, as it originated, there was conservatism, quality living, good behavior, family, responsibility. And of course, in the mid-1960s, there was a whole switch with George Wallace's and Goldwater. There is no greater civil rights leader than Jackie Robinson. He left the Republican Party because of what was going on with Goldwater in '64. To be conservative. That's what we all want. Conservative living, because that's more responsible, is a responsible behavior that we all really want. What these different parties have now presented is far different than what the true meaning of it is.
Do you believe that as a society, we are as far apart as you might think watching the news or tuning into television or radio in general these days? I would say no. To Tom and David, I'm conservative. I'm a Democrat, but I'm very conservative. Most of us are kind of somewhere in the middle, and we have our differences. The extremists that have, taken liberty of national television and have created a soap opera. And sometimes it's very entertaining for me to watch. But really, when I think about like my Republican friends, my Democratic friends, and my independent friends, we all believe and think in a way that is the same. Like I'm listening to Doug and Tom, and I'm like, I think and I feel exactly the same way that you do. And so it's so refreshing. And thank you for this conversation, because I think if we had more forums like this, even in our homes with people who don't look like us or come from backgrounds that we do, and we can share really what we think and feel, we would find that we are really right down the middle with where we should be. I believe media and social media has taken us to a place where it can make us seem like that's the norm, but that isn't the norm. The norm is we're all human beings who love each other and really love our earth that God has given us and want to see good in the world. It's just those outliers, and it's 1%, I believe, right, that have those extreme views. But again, I'm also a pastor, and so for me, being conservative, I hear some things on the Democratic side I absolutely do not align with. But for me right now, as a personal decision, is more of, again, going back to the issues of what's important. And, the rhetoric is just too much for me on the other side.
I was invited to be part of One Small Step, which gets people that come from different backgrounds, supposedly, to have a conversation. And what we find out, or what I found out as part of that conversation, is that, like you said, Tiffany, we're all relatively the same when it comes to our really core values of taking care of family, friends, the place that we live, our communities, our earth. And I hope that if that program gets a lot more airtime, other folks will get to understand that too and realize the divisions that we like to somehow espouse are really just vague plasticine disguises and not really at the very bottom of our being, I hope, I like to think, not what's really resident there.
So I'm going to go down the same path, but I'm going to broaden it outside of this country because my son was fortunate enough as he was going through his college degrees to do several study abroads, Germany, Lebanon, and Egypt. He worked for the UN in Egypt. And he had friends who, because this was in the time frame, we were Desert Storm, and there was a lot of things going on in the Mideast. So how can you deal with those people? And he was very vocal with those friends. We're all human beings. If you get away from the politics, the rhetoric, we all want the same thing. We want a roof over our head, food on our table, something of success, however you define that, for our kids. And that's true regardless of where you live or what society you claim to be with.
You just heard from Doug Bowman of East Orlando, Tiffany Jeffers from Kissimmee, Melbourne resident Tom Unrath, and David Walker from Harmony, Florida, near St. Cloud. They were speaking with Central Florida Public Media News Director Latoya Dennis and Morning Edition host Talia Blake about how they're feeling in the lead-up to the November elections. That's it for the wrap this week. Stay listening. Next week, we'll take a look at 2 election issues, how development is impacting one Volusia County race, and a proposed state constitutional amendment that would enshrine abortion access. And check out our voter guide to compare the candidates and get to know more about them during this 2024 election. That's on our website, cfpublic.org. This podcast is produced by Central Florida Public Media with assistance from News Director Latoya Dennis and Digital Director Ryan Ellison. I'm Brendan Byrne. This is The Wrap.